A medical doctor says that he came in to treat this being. He said that it had a kind of brownish skin color and that it had very large lilac-colored eyes, and that he said that through its eyes, it was able to communicate with him. Now, this sounds obviously a lot like science fiction, but the other side of the question, why would this medical doctor risk his profession, his career, his good name?
It's said that if you stop being curious, you stop growing. I'm David Wiley. This is Dave Wants to Know.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Dave Wants to Know. I am your host, Dave, and thanks so much for joining us. We're glad you are here. We've got a great show today. For hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, man has asked, are we alone in the universe? We look up at the stars and say, we couldn't possibly be the only people here. And now it seems like we're getting closer to a possible answer. And that's why we invited our guest, veteran journalist and the creator and co-founder of The Debrief and the host of the immensely popular show, the Micah Hanks program, Micah Hanks, with us.
Wonderful to be here, Dave, and I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about. Of course, there's so much happening in the world right now.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at you at first, and then maybe we can go through the things separately. But so the War Department in May releases 2 troves, as they call it, of videos, pictures, and documents. Then in early June, we have a press conference with several congressional representatives and a former intelligence officer saying they've got bodies, they're not giving all the information. And on top of all of that, Steven Spielberg, one of the greatest movie makers of all time, releases Disclosure Day. How is this? Is this all connected, or are they just coincidental events?
Well, some would say in this business there are no coincidences. And I can tell you this is all connected, but maybe not in the way that a lot of people think. So we'll start first with the Department of War releases. Great that you bring that up. There's obviously a lot of interest in this right now. A lot of speculation about the reason for the release. I try to see this as a net positive because, I've come to know, Dave, a lot of the former officials who served in the intelligence community and who have, had experiences of their own with things, which we now collectively call unidentified anomalous phenomena. For anybody wondering, it's essentially the same thing that was once known as UFOs. There's also a lot of question about why that name was changed. It's really just primarily because of concerns about the stigma with that old term. Now, every now and then you're going to hear me still slip UFO in there from time to time, just old habits, I guess.
Let me stop you there, though. The Department of War, war.gov, it says UFO. It does not say UAP. So that is interesting that they kept the old name.
That is. And it's also interesting that right there at war.gov on the main page, along with news releases and, press and inquiries and all the other things that you normally would see on a government website, you see UFO included right there, which, is a bit strange and surreal for somebody like myself who's spent, more than 2 decades with interest in this topic, but seriously pursuing it and writing about it for the better part of those last 2 decades. And I'm a pretty young guy, so that should tell you something right there. The UFO use to me is not necessarily consequential. I think it's more just a matter of that was selected simply because they assumed that people would know what that means. And it again just kind of shows the sort of continuity and in ease of moving back and forth between those 2 terms, UAP and UFO. But most officials these days tend to use UAP. We'll stick with that for now. So the Pursue initiative that, has released now 2 tranches of documents and videos. It's interesting because these are videos that we had not seen previously. And a lot of people are saying, well, but most of these videos could be almost anything. It's true that we don't see any clear flying disc, big black triangles, some of these more juicy kinds of UFO reports that we find in the literature now going back many decades, actually the better part of the last century at least. And historically speaking, we could also say that even deeper into history, there are very compelling, historical descriptions of anomalous aerial phenomena. But the latest series of videos, although I don't think they were the kinds of things that people expected or hoped to see, I got to say, I do find them very interesting. And there are a few that stand out, which if we've got a moment, maybe we could kind of touch on just a couple of those, the pop-out
Absolutely.
videos.
So of the videos, because I've heard a lot of people saying, there's not a whole lot there, but you say there's a couple maybe that we take a little closer look at.
Yeah, most certainly. Now, I will also concede a lot of the documents that have been released, there have been some new ones, but a lot of the new documents that have been put up on the website, billed as new, versions of those have been available for decades, specifically the Federal Bureau of Investigation documents. What we do have that's different is there are fewer redactions in some of those documents. It was explained to me by one official I spoke with that essentially mandatory declassification review is the process that they would use, where they can go back through a document where redactions have been included for years sometimes, and they'll have to go back through and see what can now be releasable with changes in time, with the passing of time, with new information forthcoming and other declassification protocols that occur within government. So they did that, and there's a little more information in old documents that have been re-released through that process. As far as the videos, with that first batch, one that really stood out to me was filmed in October 2023 near Greece. And it really doesn't show very much more in the video than a little object buzzing along. But intriguingly, I found that there are two written reports that accompanied the release of all these videos, and two of those correspond to this incident where they're near the Mediterranean Sea. We have this object buzzing along. There are two separate accounts given in the two written reports, and each of them contain a number, but they are numbers that are both even numbers. In other words, either the numbering system, and again, somebody out there who may be listening and who's served in the government might be able to confirm this for me, but it could be that the naming conventions and that the system used for producing those reports only used even numbers. What it seemed to suggest to me was that there may have been a grouping of reports and one was missing, that we had, 0023 and 0025. So I was wondering, immediately, okay, well, where's the one in between those two? Had there been more written reports about this video? What they describe is this object flying along. They say that the object appeared to be doing very erratic things at the time they first spotted it, and then they trained their sensors with the IR camera, and they began filming this. But they said that the object was estimated at going about 80 miles an hour, not super fast, but that it was doing very erratic, sharp right-hand turns and maneuvers as it was flying. Now, again, I'm not going to tell people out there listening, Dave, to do this, but imagine if you were going in your car and you were going 80 miles an hour and you tried to do a sudden hard right turn. It's not going to be good for anybody in the vehicle with you or in the path of that automobile. My point being, this object was doing some very unusual things. In the footage, we don't see those sharp right angle turns. We see it just moving on a steady course, but then the object appears to vanish. And as they explain in the accompanying information, they say it becomes indiscernible from the background relative to the IR sensor that's being used to film it from the drone that presumably was tracking this. The reason that's intriguing to me is because as it's flying over the water, this seems to imply that the object may have entered the water. And at that point, there's no heat signature or anything that's discernible, and therefore the IR sensor would no longer be able to track this object. So again, some of the little pieces of the data about that report were very intriguing to me, right down to the erratic motion that was described, the apparent entry into water, which again, the term in military parlance would be transmedium for that, where an object seems to be able to transition between different domains, water, air, or space. So we're seeing this aerial object clearly that vanishes. Perhaps it entered the water, not sure, but there's a pretty good case that to be made that is what appears to be happening in that video. And so that's just one example, and that's just from the first batch that everybody just said, well, there's nothing good here, nothing to see. I found some of those very interesting. Then, of course, as you mentioned, we had another release that came along right after that. And there's, I think, some important background, if I may. I mean, I'd like to maybe provide some context for this second release, because that second Pursue release, Dave, was even more intriguing, I think, not only because of the quality of some of the videos, but more specifically because there was an effort that predated the Trump administration's announcement that these videos were going to be released. Keep in mind, by the way, there was no official executive order, as had been the case with the declassification of JFK files and certain other efforts under the current administration. President Trump essentially just went on his social media site, Truth Social, and said, we're going to release some UFO files. I don't know if you've been thinking this, but when I saw that, I was kind of like, well, this will be good if something comes out. Won't hold my breath. We'll wait and see. But sure enough, they did. They've now, continued to release a lot of information. So without any kind of specific process in government, apart from the president just saying, you're going to do this, and the Department of War complied, that's pretty impressive. But even before this initiative got underway, there was a separate initiative under what's known as the Task Force for Declassification of Federal Secrets, which is led by a representative from Florida, Anna Paulina Luna, who, of course, was at that press conference yesterday, which we'll touch on here in a moment. And she had already sent a letter to the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, stating that it had come to her attention from other intelligence community officials that there were 40, I believe it was 46 videos that she had requested, and she gave brief descriptions of each of these videos and said the task force needs access to these videos as part of our investigation, and we ask for their delivery no later than, I think that the date they gave was sometime in April. Well, obviously they missed that first date, but under the second Pursue release, Anna Paulina Luna continued to liaison with the Defense Department, or War Department officials, as it's now known, and also with the current director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the official Pentagon office tasked with studying these phenomena. The new director, who's actually been in there a couple of days, but he is the second director who actually followed the inaugural director, Sean Kirkpatrick. His name is Dr. John Kozlowski. His background is in optical physics. He worked with the NSA prior to his position at Arrow. And John Kozlowski met with Representatives Luna and also Eric Burleson and seemed to be very compliant with this effort to get these videos released. And sure enough, that's what we saw in that latest batch. So this has been an ongoing effort where we had officials within the intelligence community pushing for the release because they were interested in transparency. We had lawmakers, representatives from various different states, who were also working on this on the congressional side. And then finally, the presidential, spoken, not written directive, but nonetheless, that we're going to be releasing these videos, all of this coming together and culminating in this release of videos. The second batch arguably has some better ones than the first one.
What would be one out of that second batch that you'd say this is the best of the bunch?
Yet again, it's one that most probably would think, oh, that could be anything. I realize that, Dave, people are very conditioned to want major revelations. They want to see a flying saucer. They want to see, alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And there very well may be videos that indicate those things. In fact, it has been conveyed to me that what has been released in this batch is by no means the best that is available, but there are very clear reasons why, which we could get in. Actually, I'll just briefly say a lot of that has to do with the fact that some of the better videos are still currently undergoing analysis and resolution efforts toward trying to resolve what those videos may represent. As Arrow is continuing that work, they aren't going to, in mid-investigation, release a lot of those videos. But again, it is very likely that they're working on better things. And some officials have even said there are better looking videos and better data that are still in the government's holdings, but which are still undergoing that assessment. So these videos haven't actually undergone assessment. Many of them are too indistinct to really be able to be discernible in terms of what these objects are, but there are still some intriguing clues like in that last batch. So one that stood out to me is an object, I believe this one was filmed in 2025. And in fact, I've got links to all these in the show notes on various episodes of my podcast where I've talked about this. If anybody in your listening audience would like to be able to track those down, I've got them linked right there. The video in question I'll describe for you. It shows a little white object, again, balloon-like in appearance, we might say, from this vantage, but it's obviously being filmed from a drone. I would imagine this is probably a Predator drone with its electro-optical system, which essentially is just its primary camera filming in color. It's not an infrared sensor. But this drone is flying along and it's filming this little object. Now, there is a phenomenon that is known very well, and it's called parallax, where a stationary object, as the drone is moving relative to that, the drone's camera is tracking that object. And so the optical illusion that's produced is that it looks like the object is moving against the background, whereas it's the drone that's moving, filming a stationary object. In this case, it seems very evident that's not what's happening, because as we're watching this little object flying along, suddenly then its shadow becomes discernible against a portion of the terrain, which is a very rough desert terrain. It probably looks like Iran or Afghanistan where this was filmed. The object begins to descend. You see the shadow descending. Actually, it appears to be coming closer to the object, which is what indicates descent, which is intriguing because there's clear movement being established. It's not apparently parallax. And then right at the end of the video, the little object suddenly does a right-hand turn, dips into an area of shadow, and appears to take a position of concealment. Now, when I saw this, a colleague of mine, Ryan Whalen, one of our reporters there at the debrief, also had been watching this same video the morning of the release, and he says, "Did you see this one of the little object that hides?" And I said, "Yeah, I sure did. It looks like the object is aware that it's being filmed, and it ducks into an area of shadow and tries to take a position of concealment." Yet again, we're not seeing amazing, high speed maneuvers or anything that's truly extraordinary. But what we do appear to see is an object that's not, we're not seeing motion or the appearance of it as a result of parallax, this optical illusion. There appears to be actual distinct motion. It's a change in altitude we see. And then finally, the object abruptly shifts the direction it's moving and appears to intelligently try to conceal itself. That, to me, was one of the most striking UAP videos of this latest bunch, and really maybe one of the better ones we've seen in a few years here.
From that, can you tell or can you surmise anyways whether it's a manned vehicle or perhaps being remotely controlled?
That's a great question. We can't really. Again, one colleague of mine, I showed it to him and I said, this is intriguing. We can't rule out things like UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. My colleague had said it's probably a balloon. Now, in my opinion, after having watched and rewatched this video, for it to be a balloon engaging in that very unusual motion, there would have to be a lot of wind. We maybe can't rule that out, but it certainly gives the impression of an intelligently controlled object that's engaging in very intentional changes in its motion and its direction. That is clearly what appears to be achieved in the video by this object. Now, for it to move so quickly, I would have to think that maybe this is not a manned vehicle. It seems most likely that this is some kind of drone, and I'm not saying necessarily like a little DJI, Phantom, a little quadcopter like what we see in the parks when we go for a walk on Sunday. This obviously in the terrain in which it was being operated, a very remote area, and where U.S. intelligence platforms on our own military's drones were obviously very interested in this object and tracking its movement. This seems to imply that this was an object in a place where we expected we might find something unusual, or maybe, we thought that this was unusual relative to the surrounding environment. It was intriguing enough that we wanted to track it. It appears to have an awareness that it is being tracked and it doesn't want to be followed, and it seems to try and hide. All these things to me suggest some kind of, an intentional effort to try and obfuscate or conceal itself, which is consistent with espionage, consistent with surveillance. It's very possible that this was some sort of a UAV system that was being used to track U.S. assets or to surveil them. And that may have been what brought it to the attention of the U.S. operators who were controlling the drone who started filming it. So in my opinion, we could say it's drone-like. Its movement is most consistent with some kind of drone. But again, as far as whose drone or what kind of technology is being remotely controlled, I don't know. The footage doesn't give us enough context to really be able to discern that.
Let's jump to the press conference June 9th in Washington, D.C. You mentioned Representative Anna Paulina Luna from Florida. I think Representative Burchett was there, along with former intelligence officer David Grush. It was quite the interesting press conference. They're basically saying you guys being the U.S. government are holding back. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe give us a little overview of that and then your impression of what was said there.
Certainly. So obviously, as we let off, Dave, one of your primary questions had been, is there connection between all this? Quite clearly, I think that, Spielberg had been planning to put a film out, and we'll get to the film here in a moment. I haven't seen it yet. As I understand it, you haven't either, but I think we're both expecting it's going to be really good. We plan to see it. But with the buildup to its release, I don't think it's any surprise that coinciding with these new releases under the Pursue initiative and that forthcoming film, which releases actually later this week, that there would be a press conference where UAP advocates would say, now would be a great time to stand out, in the sun in Washington and try to bring attention to this transparency effort. Strike while the iron is hot, as they say, and I think the iron is extremely hot at the moment. That said, as far as what we saw yesterday in Washington, we had, as you mentioned, Representatives Tim Burchett from Tennessee, Eric Burleson, I believe from Missouri. We had Anna Paulina Luna, of course, aforementioned, who leads the task force for the declassification of federal secrets from Florida. We also had independent filmmaker James Fox, who's a longtime colleague of mine. We also had Leslie Kane, who's an investigative journalist, who's best known probably in recent times with regard to the UAP question for co-authoring an article that appeared in the New York Times in 2017. There were several articles that followed that, including beyond the New York Times, articles that she has written along with Ralph Blumenthal, former New York Times editor for many years there. She and Ralph had co-authored an article that was published at the Debrief in 2023, which first revealed David Grush, a former National Geospatial Intelligence officer, also worked with the National Reconnaissance Office, Air Force, and other divisions within government. David Grush, of course, really took the center stage as a whistleblower with the release of his name and his story in 2023 that the Debrief first reported. And he was there yesterday as well. So it was quite a motley crew, who's who, you might say, of UAP advocates, whistleblowers, former government officials. We also had, representatives of scientific organizations like Kevin Wright from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. He was looking really cool standing back there in the back with his sunglasses on, but that's a...
Oh, yeah, I saw him.
Right, yeah, but he's a colleague of mine, and he handles press relations for us there with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. And we're hosting an event this summer up in Toronto as well. Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet was also there, who, formerly led NOAA and, of course, has become another vocal supporter for the UAP cause. And then finally, also, I'll give a shout out to Peter Skafish, who represents the Soul Foundation. He was there present as well. So again, I want to try and emphasize there were people from the scientific community, people from the humanities, people from, government, former government servants themselves, former intelligence community, independent filmmakers, journalists, people who I've worked with and know very well. And they were all coming together along with lawmakers, representatives right there in Washington saying, look, there's credible data, not only related to UAP technologies, but also we keep hearing stories about the bodies. We keep hearing stories about biologics. And it stands to reason that if some of these craft are large enough to be controlled, piloted that is, and they aren't remotely controlled like the suspected UAV type craft that we were discussing there earlier, Dave, it stands to reason that there would have to be, pilots, physical pilots. Now, the question of what they are or where they're from or who they are or what their motives are or their intentions may be, all those questions remain on the table. And for a lot of people, I think that they were hearing discussion about that, somewhat focusing right there at the outset on a very high-profile case from Brazil known as the Varginha incident. Again, as somebody who's traveled to Brazil many times myself and spent a lot of time down there getting to know those who have studied that case and the broader UFO issue, UFO UAP, that case is also near and dear to my heart. And there are many former officials, medical doctors, people with a background in law and government who have come forward and said, in Brazil, this case happened. There was a biological entity that was associated with it. One of those doctors claims he even treated it.
Can you give us a thumbnail of what that story is for those that don't know?
Certainly, yeah. So the Varginha case took place back in the early 1990s at the little locale of Varginha in Brazil. The primary story was that there were several individuals who said that they had seen a large, kind of long or tubular craft that appeared to be producing smoke. You might liken it somewhat to the now famous Tic Tac footage that was obtained off the Baja California coast in 2004 by our Navy fighter pilots. The object sighting was accompanied sometime later by a sighting of a small, humanoid type, being of some kind, as they described it. Three girls, I think two of them were younger, and then one was in her, I think, late teens at the time that they saw this. They said that they saw this entity or being. It seemed very frightened. It seemed kind of dirty and disheveled. Then there were later reports from people at an area hospital that this being or something resembling it was taken there. The story gets very unusual because there were also military officials involved, one of whom died, and the contention had been that they may have died as a result of possibly some exposure to some kind of bacteriological or other kind of, pathogen from handling or coming into contact with this being. The most striking thing in most recent times about that case is, the Varginha case has been known for years. Even many prominent Brazilian UFO researchers have kind of doubted the case and said, well, it sounds an awful lot like, America's Roswell case, and maybe those similarities are a little too, close to ignore. But there was a press conference earlier this year in Washington that the aforementioned filmmaker James Fox held, where he had firsthand witnesses from the event who, after all these years, were coming all the way to the United States, many of them Portuguese language speakers, and they're telling their story. And one of them that really stood out was a medical doctor who, at the time, says that he came in to treat this being. He said that it had a kind of brownish skin color and that it had very large lilac colored eyes. And that he said that through its eyes and through what seemingly was some kind of nonverbal communication, he said it was able to communicate with him. Now, this sounds obviously a lot like science fiction, and I realize that that's a large pill for many to swallow. But the other side of the question, and this is the baffling part for me, why would this medical doctor risk his profession, his career, his good name, all of that to come to the United States and say, I saw this thing lying in a hospital bed. It was being treated. They asked me to come in. I directly interacted with it. I saw it. It clearly was not a child. It clearly was not a puppet. It wasn't some kind of a trick or a ruse. This was a, living being, and unlike anything on earth that I know or have ever seen before or since. Why would a doctor come forward and say those things? Again, it is by its very definition extraordinary, but it is also something that more and more credible individuals have said we experienced firsthand. Now, fast forward to yesterday, that story kind of took center stage during this press conference. James Fox stood up, talked about that. Leslie Kane, who, along with Ralph Blumenthal, authored an excellent article about this that the Debrief published earlier this year. They also talked about these issues and broadly what all these people, all these former government officials, journalists, filmmakers, members of the scientific community and the humanities, all these people, they say if there's data that supports the idea that there are indeed biologics that have been recovered during incidents like that one, the American people and the world deserve to know. Don't just show us the little videos of indistinct white dots flying along. We need to know what's actually happening so that this can be assessed scientifically, culturally, in terms of planning for the future, and in terms of strategies for new technologies that may be derived from this, or possibly from potential threats that may be posed by this. And again, to be clear, there is no overt signature, sign or anything that indicates there's a threat from UAP, but there are indirect concerns like to pilots, aviators, etc., and things that need to be taken seriously. And so knowing, as G.I. Joe used to say, Dave, is half the battle. And I think that what all these people yesterday in Washington were saying is, let the American people and the world know what's really happening and let us judge for ourselves and get to work on how we deal with this.
Two things I saw highlighted from that press conference yesterday. One was that they asked for immunity for whistleblowers to tell us where are these creatures, these beings. And the other was kind of related. I don't know if it was Representative Burchett, but one of the congressmen said, that he was asked, why don't you just go to Area 51 and go look at the bodies? And he said, I'm sure they've been moved. They're not where they supposedly were taken, many years ago. Your thought about the whistleblower item and the fact that if there is evidence, the government's probably moved them. I mean, we're talking about Spielberg, the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the famous scene of the Ark being put in a warehouse, with millions of other relics.
Yeah, well, that's a great scene, by the way. And I think that's inspired a lot of people over the years to think that there is some, grand, dark, overarching conspiracy. It may be a little different from that. I think that it's a combination of there having been some things acquired, some things that maybe were acquired and it wasn't exactly clear what they were, and they may have been mishandled, lost, a number of things may have happened, and people might think, well, that's absurd. You're not going to lose something as important as, wreckage materials, substances, metallic alloys, or something that came from a flying saucer. But again, I'll point to the original archival NASA materials, many of which were lost and misplaced. And, this has been an issue that, many have brought up over the years, regardless of the whole UAP thing. So believe you me, the government does lose things, and I wouldn't be surprised if, again, we have materials that seem to be very important, but they're also baffling. We can't do anything with them, and we start changing hands. Well, let's take them from this agency to this agency, and now let's hand them off to this contractor so that people will stop asking us about it, and that way we can have plausible deniability. We don't have that in our possession. But then when the contractors have it, they aren't subject to Freedom of Information Act requests or transparency or accountability that, the same style that the government would be. And in the case of FOIA, there is you know, no reason for them to be compliant to a FOIA. I could send a FOIA request to my local hamburger shop, but they're not going to have to reply and tell me what they're doing, right? So my point is, there are a lot of ways that things could get lost. But now, as far as the whistleblower side of things, presuming that there are materials and maybe something more, maybe biologics, Dave, the story we keep hearing from whistleblowers is that there have not only been such recoveries, but there is what some refer to as a legacy program. And the idea of this legacy program is that maybe going back to as possibly as early as the 1940s, but maybe at least as early as the 1950s, that whatever these acquisitions were and whatever kinds of materials and other information we have, they clearly would have been of national security significance and possibly also of defense significance. But primarily, the intention would be we want to try and study and understand these things, and we want to replicate whatever their capabilities are so that we can possess that technology and we can have that before our enemies find something similar. And if we have obtained these things from wreckages, whether they were shot down or they were uncovered or obtained through other means, that possibility always exists that other nations and their scientists may gain access to these things too. And again, a great historical corollary for this. At the end of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union were both very eager to try and get Nazi scientists and Nazi technologies. And there were programs. The U.S. component of this was called Operation Paperclip. But there was also a Japanese version of that where we brought Japanese scientists back to the United States at the end of the Second World War, which was probably as, if not more, controversial than bringing the Germans back over to work for us. Then the Soviets had their own version of those programs. And so my point is, anytime we think we can get access to a new technology, the potential that it could be obtained by our enemy is of utmost importance. And we want to move swiftly and try and get as much and learn as much as we can. So the idea of a legacy program extends beyond just German technologies. It extends to the idea that somewhere along the way, UAP, whatever they are and wherever they're from, are somewhere in government's holdings. And that's what the story that all these whistleblowers keep telling us is, primarily with David Grush. He says he's interviewed, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of, between 35 and 40 individuals who have all talked about having knowledge of this alleged legacy program. Dave, I too have talked to officials who say that they have spoken to individuals who had been part of that legacy program and that they had knowledge of it. I've spoken to individuals who have claimed to have knowledge of things that were kept at Area 51. And what's frustrating, I think, for journalists like you and I is that none of them have been able to show me photographs. None of them have been able to show me any receipts, so to speak. And so we're left at the end of the day with that great conundrum where the scientists and the law, professionals always collide. The scientists would say, show us the hard evidence. We haven't seen any yet. We've got to concede that. But then, the professionals with a background in jurisprudence or, a background in law, they're going to say, yeah, but, with the testimony that these whistleblowers are providing, if somebody showed up in a court of law, they were sworn in under oath and they stated under oath, this is what I saw and what happened, you could send a person to jail based on that kind of testimony. So we have to put some weight behind the testimony of the whistleblowers, especially the number of them that come forward, the consistency in the narratives. I don't believe all of the whistleblowers, I'll be clear. There are some who I'm very suspicious of, but there are also some who, based on the background and the vetting and the processes of trying to discern who they are, what they did while in government, how credible they are, how reliable they are, and how well-known they are to be trustworthy based on what their colleagues have told me. Some I do believe, and they tell a story that's consistent with this idea of this legacy program.
So I have two whistleblowers I want to get your thought on. Former intelligence officer Jay Stratton, apparently writing a book as we speak, going to be out later this year, that he says is going to blow the roof off everything. Your thoughts on Jay Stratton?
Yeah, well, I know Jay Stratton very well. In fact, I was visiting with him in Huntsville, Alabama, just a couple of weekends ago. I know Jay to be a very credible person. I know Jay to be a very honest and very reliable person. I think most journalists, they go asking people questions and trying to get them to know, get to know them so that they can then put them on the record immediately and try to get them to spill all the beans, so to speak. I've taken a very different approach with getting to know Jay. We met first in 2022, I believe, at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies conference there in Huntsville, Alabama. And, I just as a one off, my colleague, Tim McMillan, co founder of The Debrief, had communicated with Jay a few times, and they had never met. I should be clear because Tim had been in Germany at the time and he's still in Europe because his wife works with the military as a teacher. And so they've been there for a long time. And Jay had just left government at that point, and I didn't, necessarily think I would have a great opportunity for a one-on-one at this big conference. But I put a bug in his ear, and I said, if the opportunity came up and we could talk, I would love to chat with you. And the last day of the conference, I looked over my shoulder at the back of the room, and there's Stratton standing back there, and he's kind of going like this. And so I told my colleague, Chrissy Newton, I said, Stratton wants to talk. I'll be right back. And then I said, actually, grab your stuff. You're coming too. And so Newton and I went out there, and we had about 45 minutes, just one-on-one, off the record, nothing for quotes or for an article. But Jay and I just got to know each other and talk that day. And we have kept in touch. And through many years now, of course, we have, built a good friendship, I think. And that to me is far more important than being the person who rushes out there to get him on the microphone or to get him on the record to talk about things, because obviously he wants to share his story with the world, and that's what he intends to do with his book, which is coming out later this year. But for me, and this is why this is important, knowing Jay and knowing how credible he is, having picked his brain a lot behind the scenes about the inner workings of not just the UAP issue. Sure, we talk about that, but to talk about the intelligence community and to talk about the processes. He is a great person to talk to about those things, and he's always willing to try and help others learn, and he's helped me learn a lot. That side of getting to know Jay has been the most important thing, because it says to me, here's a career professional who is taken very seriously. I believe at the time he left government, he was the equivalent, keep in mind he was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, but he was the equivalent of a two-star admiral, essentially, in his rank. So that makes him effectively one of the highest ranking, if not the highest ranking, former government official to have dealt with the UAP topic. He received a meritorious citation from the former Director of National Intelligence, not just for work he did with the ONI, no, specifically for the UAP task force. The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, saw such merit in the work that he and his team did that they decided to give them, essentially a recognition, a sort of award for that. So the Jay Stratton I've come to know is highly credible. He's a person who's had some extraordinary experiences in his life. He's a person who also led an all-government effort to try and collect data and understand and resolve UAP and find out what that is. He still has questions just like I do, but I think that it's very important that we have a person of his stature and his credibility coming out and talking about this story.
And I know we're all waiting for the book, but I know that he has claimed that he's seen actual, at least parts of bodies, parts of craft of some type. Is that what he told you, and you're on the record discussions?
I will abstain from making a whole lot of comment about that for right now. And again, no problem with you asking. But what I will say, however, as opposed to offering statements about that, because we have, of course, discussed what he's experienced and what he's seen. I think because at the current time, namely the statements he's made in films, well, the film The Age of Disclosure, many people inferred that he says he's seen bodies on ice at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base somewhere or something like that. I can tell you that's not what Jay said, but I think that people, and this is an important learning experience, people have in their minds this idea of, well, that's what the UFO reality is. There have been crash retrievals, and there are bodies somewhere. So if he says he's seen so-called non-human intelligence, or NHI, he saw those bodies. That's what people immediately think. That's not really what he said. Again, he will clarify that in his book, and it's not my place to talk about that here, nor will I, but I do want to clarify the difference between what he has and has not said about, his experiences.
And people who, as a journalist, I respect what you did, and that is, you didn't just go in for the kill or for the soundbite. That's called developing a source. And in journalism, that's what you do. You try to get a rapport with people. And in your case, sounds like you guys have a friendship, or at least a good acquaintanceship. And that's part of the journalism game. The other whistleblower I want to ask about is perhaps the most well-known, and that is Bob Lazar. I've heard all kinds of things about him, and I'm curious your thoughts on Bob Lazar. Whether you think he is telling the truth, or is he weaving a tale?
Yeah, that's again a fair question. Now, you'll notice I speak very highly of Jay Stratton, because I've worked very hard to cultivate a good relationship there. And like you mentioned, and again, I love talking with people with a background in journalism like yours, because you understand, unlike anyone else, you never burn a source. You know, sources are to be handled with great care. That's how a journalist obtains information and how we learn, and frankly, more broadly, how the entire world learns. Now, with regard to Bob Lazar, I've never met Bob Lazar. I've been very intrigued by his story for many decades, as I know that many people have been. But unlike Jay Stratton, I have a lot more questions about Bob Lazar and his claims. Bob, of course, claims that he has had direct access to, you know, recovered craft, and that he had, worked on those at this facility called S4, which was part of Area 51. He claims that his professional background and certain other information about his past government work had been essentially wiped, blank slate after he was caught taking people, including John Lear, who back in the 1990s was a very prominent UFO activist and researcher. But he had been taking people like Lear up there as close as you could get to Area 51 in the dark without actually being there on the property. And they would go and they would watch. And sure enough, Lazar did know when things would show up in the sky there near Area 51. So clearly he seemed to have some knowledge of the inner workings of what was happening out there. And they got caught one night by some security personnel. And the whole story gets a little stranger even from there, because it turns out that they were surveilling Bob according to the story, but it didn't have to do with anything he was doing that was illicit. It was actually because they'd found out, I think his wife was cheating on him, was the story, and they were concerned about, what his mindset would be. And so they were monitoring phone calls and all kinds of things. When Bob came out with his story, though, back in the 90s, I mean, it went off like an atom bomb. And that was first reported, of course, by, veteran journalist George Knapp. And I think the world of George. I would love to meet Bob and talk to him sometime. But although there've been a lot of consistencies in the way he's told his story, there are also aspects of it that, others have challenged. There've been some who have, said that not all of Bob's story necessarily lines up perfectly. Some former officials like Chris Mellon have gone so far as he stated on the Joe Rogan podcast. This is no secret. He said he went to Area 51 to try and find out what was going on. And I think the story he had been told was that Bob had been someone who did work there, but that he maybe embellished the nature of his role. He had been the guy who scanned the security or the radiation badges as people were leaving the facilities. He told this, story about having worked on flying saucers. Now, another official who gave me a different take on all this had said, based on what I was able to learn, it seems that Bob believes everything he's saying and thinks he's telling the truth, but he was actually a node for disinformation. He was actually being shown things and told things that weren't true at all. And the intention was, hey, this guy seems like he'll go out and probably tell about all this, and that will help us spread disinformation. So that's another version that another official had brought to my attention. So again, when you look at all these different interpretations, what we're left with is a person who tells an extraordinary tale. Unlike other officials, Dave Grush, Jay Stratton and others, I can't find any verifiable information that backs up those claims. And again, as a journalist, you got to be able to vet those sources. You got to be able to back up their claims. Now, George Knapp will say, and we also were successful in finding his name listed in the directory at Los Alamos Labs, where he said he worked. There was a picture of him right there on the front of one of their newsletters. So again, there is some information that has surfaced that clearly shows he had some kind of job out there. And yet again, you got a veteran journalist who's bringing that information to light. So good on George Knapp. I think there's still a lot of questions about Bob Lazar. I'm not convinced by the entire story, but it's hard to deny that he was doing something there in that area at that time.
Okay. So I've got yet another bizarre story, and this is much more recent, and that is a month or so back, there were several Christian pastors that came forward and said they were taken to an Airbnb in the mountains somewhere and briefed by government officials. I guess the story is something that some of the things that were going to be coming out from disclosure would upset people in the religious community or would have them questioning their faith. Now, some of at least one of the pastors I know kind of backtracked a little bit on that, but do you think that really happened, or were they misled by somebody else, or what's going on there?
Yeah, Dave, it's a weird situation. What I can confirm is that it was at least reported in the New York Times, no less a venerable source than the Gray Lady, and the very same one, of course, who broke this whole thing wide open in 2017 with the article by Kane and Blumenthal. There certainly was a article that said that these pastors uh, all went out to this Airbnb. The story, as it was reported there, had been that they were given some, snacks and refreshments, and people were told to turn their phones off or put them on airplane mode, I think. And then they said, the way it was described, it wasn't explicitly said government officials. They just said two shadowy individuals show up, and they began this presentation that went on for quite some time, talking and essentially kind of, you might say warning, that's a strong word, but they were essentially warning these pastors that there could be some, some existential shock from the revelations that were forthcoming. Now, many pastors have talked about this. As you mentioned, some have also somewhat kind of, walked that back a little bit. So it remains unclear exactly what happened and who was being briefed and who was doing the briefing. The intriguing thing to me, though, is that I think, like a lot of the UFO whistleblower claims, there's enough of a story and enough people telling the same story in this case that it seems very likely to me that something happened. But then there's also that aspect of it where, okay, but then there are people who are, you know, they're interpreting and they're maybe embellishing and adding things onto it. So what's true, what portions of the story are real and what can be verified, and then what, has been kind of added on after the fact. Things that I find interesting about this are the I guess the timing in terms of how this story came out, almost immediately before the first tranche of documents were released under the Pursue initiative by the Department of War. Now, there was also nothing, revelatory in that release. There wasn't any kind of existential shock that emanated from those videos or files. So, had there been someone perhaps who was anticipating there was going to be a whole lot of stuff coming out, and they took it upon themselves and said, hey, we're going to go tell some of our pastor buddies, just get ready in case stuff gets weird, had that in itself been disinformation? I mean, there is precedent for people, both in the scientific community, journalists, authors, and others, um, having communication with government officials who have presented information which is false information, but they present that for, ulterior motives. And again, that is what we would, call disinformation. So counterintelligence would be another term for that. So is it possible that this was some sort of a counterintelligence operation? And if so, why would they target, pastors, right? I don't know the answers to those questions, Dave, but it's a very weird situation. And something tells me that, yet again, there's got to be something at the core of it that rings true.
Interesting. So let's talk about the Disclosure Day, the movie. We actually jokingly talked about this on another show that Spielberg and President Trump must have gotten together and planned this all together. I don't think they're really good buddies, so I think that's unlikely. But is Spielberg just using this as kind of a marketing tool? I mean, a movie takes several years to make, so that would seem unlikely. Or is this just a big, again, coincidence? We kind of touched on that at the big earlier in the show.
Well, I think as far as the explicit connections between the Trump administration and Steven Spielberg, I think it's mostly coincidental. But again, the fact that these things have happened temporally so close to one another has certainly been noticed. Now, Spielberg himself recently, I think it was at the London premiere, they were asking him, first of all, is this film soft disclosure? I mean, are you really actually telling us what's going on? Are you giving us the real scoop on aliens and UFOs? And Spielberg said, no, not at all. He said, I am conveying in this film what I think based on everything that I have had access to, which is basically stuff that everybody else has access to. He says, I think that we've been lied to for the last 79 years. And my best assessment of what's happening, that's what you find in this film. Now, he also said, I think it's very serendipitous. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. These weren't his exact words, but he said, I think it's very, novel that everything that's coming out with the government right now that's happening happens to coincide with what's going on with this film. But there maybe is a little bit more continuity there too, because we can point to the film The Age of Disclosure, which he didn't say it in that interview, by the way, which had been with one of the senior editors with the Metro for their film and entertainment. But he has said, I believe, in another interview that he had been influenced by the film The Age of Disclosure. That film, of course, was made by filmmaker Dan Farah. But Dan Farah also was involved with Ready Player One. And Dan Farah, as I understand it, also knows Steven Spielberg. So I find it very hard to believe that Dan Farah and Steven Spielberg, with their relationship, that Steven wouldn't have, been very well aware of what's going on in the Age of Disclosure, and that this had been a part of the building narrative that influenced the film that he's now releasing in theaters this Friday. But he maintains it's a fictional representation. It's my best guess based on stuff I've heard, but I think it's just, obviously clearly related to the actual current disclosure issue, and that's probably the clearest connection. Now, with regard to that press conference, though, good on them for getting out there and for talking about this. But yet again, I think that also it's UAP advocates who see an opportunity. They're like, hey, look, this film's coming out. This is fresh on people's mind. We just saw these Trump documents. Let's get out there and remind people that apart from what we're seeing on the silver screen and in Hollywood, there's a real transparency effort, a real effort to disclose. We need a real disclosure day, not just one in the movies.
All right, so I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. So my amateur mind, I don't claim to be a UFO or UAP investigator, but my amateur mind says these things have to be one of four things, okay? They have to be either something from another planet or another galaxy or whatever, or they're unknown species that's living here on our Earth. They're military, unknown military, or there's some kind of, as Vice President Vance has talked about, spiritual or interdimensional factor to this. Do you think any of those fit, or do none of them fit?
Maybe all of them fit. How I'd like to answer that question is a similar question I asked Jacques Vallée, the veteran UFO researcher who, he had known Hynek and they'd worked together back in the days of Project Blue Book, and of course, a legendary researcher in his own right since then. I asked Vallée, I said, Vallée, you've always seemed to kind of imply that this phenomenon is not extraterrestrial, not alien. Its aspects are so weird that we can't easily place it in any category. If you alluded to anything, it was maybe interdimensional. But then he wrote this book a few years ago about an alleged crash out there in the New Mexico desert back in the 40s. And I said, does this mark a shift in your attitude toward what this phenomenon is? What do you think this is? And Jacques had a very beautifully simple and eloquent answer. He said, it's all one thing. It's all one thing. Now, I think a lot of people, when they heard him say that, they thought he was saying, well, everything's connected and there's a grand unified theory of the paranormal. I don't think that's what he meant. Jacques was saying, if you study UAP, if there's an alleged crash involving technology from off-planet, you're going to study that. If some of these things are really strange and the best definition culturally, historically, and otherwise that we have for these aspects of some of the phenomena are jinn, demons, some kind of entity that is something that we would associate with, past traditions of spirituality and things like that, you're going to study that too, right? If you're a person who is interested in government conspiracies and you think that some UAP are just our own test platforms and novel surveillance capabilities, you're going to study that. See, I study all these things. And at various times I'll lean in one direction more than the other. But if you're a person who studies UAP, you can't say, well, I think they're all this or that they're all that. I think some may be extraterrestrial. I think many are probably surveillance platforms, probably contractor technologies, things that have been, built by our defense contractors. Some may be government platforms that are known and that are, have been used for years in our government, but which have not been publicly disclosed. Some may also belong to foreign adversaries. Some may be unique natural phenomenon like these so-called intelligent plasmas that we've heard a lot about in recent years. I have a UAP sightings reporting system at uapsightings.org that I've been running for a couple of years now, and I get a lot of reports of these plasma-like orbs that appear to engage in very intelligent movement and behavior. Is that what we saw in some of those videos that have been released by the Department of War? Possibly. And then you hear the stories from people who say these things, show up in my bedroom at night and they say, God can't help you now. you know, you have to look at all of it. And I think it's really challenging for a lot of people in our modern, very secular society. And I try to think as scientifically and if you want to say secularly, I try to think that way when I'm in my journalist hat and to be as skeptical and rational as possible. But sometimes late at night, Dave, you also have to jump onto the other partition. You put your open-minded hat on and you have to just go, but what else could be going on? We don't have all the answers. We don't know. What if the things we call angels or demons actually have a very valid scientific explanation that we are just, light years away from discerning? But one day that'll be science. And we'll be like, it's funny how we interpreted that spiritually. Now we know exactly what that is. We may say the same thing about UAP. We may say the same thing about extraterrestrials. And it may be very evident just a few years from now, hey, they've been here for a long time. They've been coming here for forever. And we had such a hard time figuring it out. And it was all right there in front of us. It was right under our nose. And we just couldn't convince people. So maybe we are in the age of disclosure. But again, I maintain a healthy distance from speculating about what they are, where they're from, pet theories and the like, sacred cows. You study all of it. It's all one thing.
I think that's a great way to end the interview. I think we could talk for hours on this. It is such an intriguing topic. But Micah Hanks, host of the Micah Hanks program, and of course, founder and creator of The Debrief. We really appreciate you taking the time to give your insights on Dave Wants to Know.
Dave, I want to know too. And thank you for having me. I hope we'll do it again sometime, okay?